One of my favorite parts about working in podcasting and being a podcaster is hearing people's podcast recommendations and learning about new podcasts. I mean, is there anything better than finding an incredible podcast with hundreds of episodes to completely obsess over and listen to day and night and ask every single person that you see, oh my gosh, have you listened to this podcast? I mean, I really don't think so. That it's hard to get better than that. This week's episode is kind of different from my normal lesson-based episodes, but I thought since it's the week of Christmas and it's the end of the year, that this would be the perfect time to just let loose and talk about podcasting and all the podcasts that we've loved in 2024. Hello and welcome to Podcast for Profit. My name is Morgan Franklin. I'm a podcast producer, strategist, and educator. This podcast will help you create and grow a podcast that cuts through the noise of social media and speaks directly to your target audience. If you're ready to create a podcast that will align you with the experts in your industry, position yourself as a trusted leader, and create another source of revenue for your business, you're in the right place. First and foremost, one of the few podcasts that I've listened to every single episode of this year is the Broski Report with Brittany Broski. And if you don't know who Brittany is, she is a TikTok and YouTube personality. You might know her from her first meme that ever went viral of her trying kombucha and thinking that she liked it and then kind of thinking it's gross and then having a second thought and then kind of a third thought. And to me, she is just exactly the kind of silly and smart host that I love to listen to. It feels like every time I listen to her podcast that I am listening to a friend just kind of catch up with me on a one-way voice note. I made a video about this a few months ago, but I think that really good content and the content that is going to move the needle moving forward into 2025 and beyond, whether it's a 30-second TikTok video or a 3-hour-long podcast episode, is going to feel like you are listening to a friend, like you are hanging out with a friend and they're just talking and you're just listening. The thing that I love about Brittany is that she worked so hard to be consistent and to be relevant and to be purposeful. And as I'm like rattling off all these corny buzzwords, I feel like I have to explain myself, but she doesn't really just bring things up just for the sake of bringing them up. You know what I mean? She brings them up to go deeper into what they really mean for her and for us as the listener. I'm thinking about this episode specifically that she did this summer where she was talking about the catacombs under Paris. And she was telling a story about how she went to the Summer Olympics. And, you know, she could have made this story all about her. She went to the Olympics. She was invited to the Olympics. This could have been just such a self-centered story. But she took the time to talk about what it meant to her and to talk about something that she was really interested in, and you could feel that passion. Like, she is very interested in the French catacombs. And then from there, she really did a lot of very purposeful research, and it was very well presented just on the catacombs and death and what it means to live and die and how we can take more than just memories from the places that we visit. We can take history. And that was such a beautiful episode. And it was so incredible. And it could have just been so shallow. You know what I mean? She could have just talked about, oh, I got invited to go to the Paris Olympics, blah, blah, blah. But instead, she told something about herself. And she tried to educate the audience. And she tried to start a bigger conversation that meant more than just the shallow things that she had done at the Olympics, even though that is incredible on its own, right? But she took that extra step. And like every good friend, Brittany Broski is constantly putting in the effort and showing up for her listeners. I mean, she feels like a friend to me. And through her actions and her effort, she has earned my attention. And that's why I never miss an episode of her show. Now, is it for everyone? No, of course not. She is a wacky girl in her mid-20s that moved from Texas to LA and went from working in an insurance call center to being an influencer and screaming at the top of her lungs about how much she loves Timothée Chalamet in Dune. And is that going to be for everyone? No, of course not. But that's why you as a podcaster should always be pursuing your highest self and showing your audience who you really are. Because while some people probably think that Brittany Broski is one of the most annoying podcasters to ever rank on the charts. She's one of my favorite creators of all time. Speaking of friendship and podcasts that I've listened to every single episode of in 2024, my real life friends Elaine Boyd and Micah Johnson, they host Automate Your Agency, and it's a podcast that really I would recommend to any kind of business owner. I know that it's technically targeted for agency owners, but there is just so much valuable information about scaling a team and growing your business. And of course, probably most importantly, how to properly incorporate automation and AI into your workflow. I have learned so much from this podcast about automation that I really haven't seen anywhere else online. It's helping me to create systems that no other podcast producer has even thought of. And I truly learn something new every single week. My favorite episode of their podcast this year was about how to effectively run a meeting. And I know that sounds kind of boring and like, who cares? But if you're a business owner, you know how much it matters and how much you should care, because you know a ton of time and money gets wasted doing meetings that could have just been an email or a Slack message, or worse, you have the meeting and nothing actually gets accomplished, or you have to have another meeting because that meeting got too out of hand. I just remember in this episode that they had so many good ideas for how to organize and prioritize action items for the team and how to redistribute those ideas and action items to actually get them accomplished. And of course, the best part is that it's all automated. You know, the podcast is Automate Your Agency. So yeah, it's all automated. So once you set it up, you really don't have to worry about it anymore. It's just a system that's set up that your entire team can use to help make everything more efficient for everyone. And I'll speak from personal experience here. Elaine and Micah are two of the most creative and giving educators in the AI space. So definitely check out Automate Your Agency. And of course, I'll have all of the podcasts that I'm talking about in this episode linked in the episode description. Next, and my apologies in advance, because I know that these podcasts really have nothing to do with each other. They're just genuinely the podcasts that I love to listen to. And some might not be relevant to you at all, but they are all the podcasts that I've listened to every episode of. So next up is Radio Rental by Payne Lindsay. I've been listening to Payne Lindsay's podcast since his first podcast, which was Up and Vanish. That was released in 2016. It's crazy to think about listening to podcasts in 2016. So Radio Rental is from his production company. It's called Tenderfoot TV. And it's kind of a true scary stories like from listeners. So basically people write in and they tell their spooky or unexplained story, and they'll come in and record. And they do all kinds of special like post-production to make it sound as dramatic and scary as possible. It's kind of like listening to a movie. I love scary stories. I love the unexplained, so I never miss an episode of it. I will say, while the quality of the show and the post-production audio editing have improved 2,000% since it started, the stories just aren't as good as they used to be, which I hate to say because I love Payne Lindsay and I love the show, but it feels kind of lazy, the past season especially. Oh, and the host of the show is Rainn Wilson. He played Dwight Schrute in the United States version of The Office. He plays a character called Terry Carnation, who owns a VHS store. And so all these stories are supposed to be tapes that he found in a store. So like I said, I've loved this show for years. It feels like the stories are getting kind of flat compared to what they used to be. But, you know, every once in a while, I'll still hear an episode and I'll be like, oh my gosh, I'm so spooked out by this. The best episode of the year so far was about a man that thinks that he sees a time traveler on his Ring camera. So I guess that he owns an Airbnb a few states away from where he actually lives. And he thinks that he sees a man in his backyard. So he calls the cops. When the cops come, they don't find anybody. Then the next day, a much older man who looks very similar to the man that he saw walking around in his yard the day before comes out of the shed in his backyard. Now, he never saw anybody going into the shed. He never got an alert that somebody went into the shed. It is just totally unexplainable. It's a great story, and I'm still honestly kind of stumped by it. Next, and as I told you, these have nothing to do with each other. Next is Simple Pin Podcast. I feel like there is not a day that goes by that I'm not trying to recommend this show to someone that wants to start a Pinterest account. This podcast is outstanding for anyone that's trying to grow their presence on Pinterest. Also, it is no fluff. It's what I try to do for you on this podcast. Just straightforward. I'm giving you the facts. I'm telling you what you need to do. We're getting in and out of here in 30 minutes. The host, Kate, has been working in Pinterest marketing for over a decade, and she has such a clear way of explaining how these systems work and how that they are going to work for you. When I started listening to this podcast, my Pinterest grew by 1,000% in a month. And if that doesn't tell you everything that you need to know, I don't know what will. Pinterest is amazing. If you know me, you know I love Pinterest, especially for podcasters, so you need to listen to this podcast. My favorite episode this year was about how to figure out what advice for Pinterest is true or not. And I thought this was a really good lesson on using media literacy and curiosity to take what serves for your business and leave what doesn't. We always get so much advice on social media and Pinterest and podcasting and everything else. It was also a great reminder to just test things out, which is exactly what I would tell you. If you are questioning something that I say about a podcast or advice for a podcast, test it out for yourself. Most of the time, people like me and Kate are just trying to give the best advice for the most amount of creators. And sometimes it's not the best advice for every single person. So make sure that you're always checking your sources and that you're testing new ways of doing things. And of course, if you want to start a Pinterest for your podcast, listen to Simple Pin Podcast. Next is Today Explained. And funny enough, well, I love this podcast. I have found recently their kind of middle of the road reporting has found a way to make everyone in America mad. So again, there is a lesson in this for all of us, which is a friend to all is usually a friend to none. For most listeners, if you're trying to take both sides, you're going to end up making everybody mad. As this has been an election year in the United States, I've been listening to even more political podcasts than normal, which is normally a lot. So I've listened to this podcast almost every single day. Something that I really enjoy about this podcast is they take a very topical recent event, usually that happened the day before. They publish every single day, Monday through Friday, and they'll give 2 different segments on it. I think with the intention of showing more than one side to the story, as there always is more than one side to the story. But for a lot of listeners, they just don't want to hear it. As a podcaster, you have to read the room. And if you don't know who your audience is, you cannot serve them. And I think that while I love this podcast, they have to figure out where they stand on issues and do a more concise job at providing the topics and intel to their core listeners and what they want to hear, so they are not just constantly bombarded by these 1-star reviews every single day, getting hate from both sides. Next is an independent podcast called the Extra Credits Podcast. It is a podcast all about movies that is hosted by a husband and wife pair that are both English teachers. I'm a movie buff, so of course, every time I watch a new movie, especially one that I really like, I want to hear somebody that's smarter than me talk about it. And Kelsey and Trey are absolutely the people to do it. I'm not sure if it's because I'm so used to watching TikTok videos and my brain is now just a bowl of mashed potatoes, or I can't concentrate on more than one thing at a time. But the themes that they pull out of these movies are truly remarkable. And it helps me to think about what I have just watched in a totally different way. And it always is just so crazy to me. They do a wonderful job on this podcast, especially for it to be a self-produced show. And if you love movies, you need to listen to it. My favorite episode of their podcast, and it's actually from 2022. It's not from this year. I just looked it up. I thought it was from this year. It's when they host the director of Barbarian. His name is Zach Krager. And if you don't remember the movie Barbarian, it is with Justin Long and Bill Skarsgård about a girl that rents an Airbnb that someone else already rented for the night. And I'm not going to say anything else other than that, because if you haven't seen the movie, it is just so good. I don't want to ruin anything for you, but you need to watch it. If you have watched it, you need to go listen to this episode. And congratulations to Kelsey and Trey for landing that guest. What an amazing guest. And you can be an indie podcaster and still get high profile guests. I do it all the time. All you need to do is ask, and then ask again, and then ask again and again. And you're going to get a lot of no's, but you are also going to get a lot of yeses too if you just keep going. Okay, and lastly, even though I know this is cheating, I'm going to say this podcast Podcast for Profit with Morgan Franklin. And yes, I listen to my own podcast, and I am proud to be my own fan. And I hope that you are proud to be a fan of your own podcast too, because if you aren't, who else is going to be? Seriously, if you are not your number one fan, how do you expect anyone else to be? My favorite episode so far, and again, I will link it in the episode description, is episode 21, Good versus Great Podcast, the one skill you must master. It's all about storytelling and being a better storyteller on your podcast. I think this is the most important thing for any podcast host or producer or creator of any kind to master. And if you haven't listened to that episode, you absolutely should. I'd love to hear about your favorite podcasts of 2024. Please feel free to send me a DM. I want to know. I want to listen to them. Also, there is still time to book a discovery call to start your podcast in 2025. My contact form will be linked in the episode description, also with my online storefront for podcasters. I hope that you get some rest. You get to spend some time with friends and family. And as always, I can't wait to listen to your podcast. Hey, thank you so much for joining me on this episode. If you enjoyed the podcast and you'd like to hear more episodes like this one, go ahead and subscribe to the show. New episodes air every Monday morning. And if you found this episode valuable and you want to help other business owners and podcasters, will you leave me a 5-star review? It helps the show rank higher in the charts and brings more entrepreneurs the information they need to start making money on their podcast.